Now that we've laid down the foundation, we can start making changes to our original recipe. As you get more comfortable with cooking, you will begin to realize that you don't always have the time or means to run to the store for every ingredient you don't have. In some cases, you can make substitutions to save time and money. In this section, we're going to cover some common substitutions, but check out myrecipes.com's substitution glossary for more substitutions. Let's talk about some basic swaps. Firstly, dry herbs and fresh herbs. Dry and fresh herbs can be used almost interchangeably. Note that if you're substituting fresh herbs for dry, you should use 3 times more fresh herbs, and if you're subbing dry for fresh, you should use 3 times less. Dry herbs are way more potent than their fresh counterparts, so in most cases, the exchange is not even. If you're ever asked to include buttermilk, which is not generally a typical ingredient, but in some cases you'll need, you can make a substitution by taking any kind of milk and mixing in a small amount of white vinegar or lemon juice and letting it sit for a few minutes to create clumps. The flavor is basically identical. If you're ever out of butter in a non-baking recipe, you can always substitute a different kind of oil and vice versa. Nuts and seeds are generally interchangeable as well when they're not the primary player in a recipe. For recipes that require walnuts, you can always sub in things like pecans or pine nuts, for example. Spices are generally pretty forgiving, depending on the recipe. Use your best judgment. If a spice or seasoning is a primary flavor, usually you'll need more than just a pinch of it in the recipe. You should probably include it. Anything else is likely either to be left out or exchanged, and the recipe will be fine. Be careful though. Changing seasoning can alter the taste of the entire dish. Many times, the combination of several seasonings is what makes a dish taste the way it does. We'll cover some basic flavor profiles later on, but you can use this substitution to create new and interesting flavors. For vegetables and fruit, usually staying in the same family works best. So, stone fruit can be subbed for another type of stone fruit, like peaches and plums. Cruciferous vegetables like broccoli can be exchanged for cauliflower. Root vegetables like potatoes can be subbed for parsnips and yams. Berries like strawberries for blueberries and raspberries, just to name a few. You might also need to make substitutions for dietary restrictions. Here's just a few. Honey, maple syrup, and agave and other natural sweeteners can always make a substitution for plain sugar. Note that this doesn't necessarily apply to baking scenarios, so you'll have to hold on to the next section to learn what to do there. Always start small when you're making these substitutions and taste and adjust as you go. Meat and seafood can be replaced with the equivalent meat-free option, like tofu, meatless crumbles, tempeh, or seitan, in most cases. If your recipe relies on the texture of meat, just note that you may need to add additional binding agents like breadcrumbs or flours or additional fat like vegan butter or oils to mimic the texture or taste of meat. For taste, depending on whether you'd like it to taste like meat or not, you can also add additional spices or fake chicken or beef bouillon to add a more savory flavor. If you have a gluten intolerance, you can find substitutions for all of your wheat-based products in nut or other grain flours. You can check out Now Foods list. They have a pretty great infographic with substitutions for gluten intolerance. If you're just staying away from carbs, you could also use vegetables to replace the carbs altogether, like zoodles, zucchini noodles for pasta, and cauliflower rice instead of regular white rice. For dairy, there are many non-dairy options meant to mimic the taste of dairy. There's fake cheeses, tofu sour cream and cream cheese, and nut milks, just to name a few. Again, remember that changing these ingredients might require additional seasoning or adding in ingredients to help with the texture. Taste as you go and add until you're satisfied with the dish.